Beatrice Dupuy is a professor of French and Applied Linguistics here at the U of A, chair of the SLAT program and co-director of Circle. And her research focuses on language teacher professional development, literacy-based approaches to teaching and learning, and experiential learning as a theoretical and practical framework for language education in home and study abroad.
Thank you. All right. Well, first I'd like to thank Janice and Julieta for their invitation to participate, and as such to have a preview of 3 really interesting studies. And what I'm going to do is to quickly highlight, again, the main points, just because some of you have come in late, so there's been a little bit of movement. Also highlight what I think is a cross-cutting theme in these papers, and then maybe consider, also kind of contextualize what they've done within recent calls for new approaches, new ways of collecting data in regards to study abroad that have been made recently. And then I want to offer some possibilities, something maybe to think about, just because, like you mentioned in my introduction, I'm more coming from the foreign language education side, looking at teachers, and if I've done interviews, it's been mostly with novice language teachers and their socialization into the profession. So that's what I'll do, and then we'll open up for further questions, and hopefully I won't be too long. So for those of you, I'm going to do a brief recap on these studies. What I think is the contribution it's making to the study abroad body of knowledge, and that's in relation to previous calls, and then I want just to look ahead and giving some suggestions as to what could be there. So we had 3 papers, and just reminding the names of the researchers as well as the focus of their studies. And here what I'm doing is just, I'm highlighting the main points or what I remembered after reading things, but the first study really examined how one researcher, so Victoria, socialized Japanese undergraduate study abroad students into language and culture learner subject positions and practices via jointly constructed talk in interviews and the multiple roles and identities performed by both the researcher and the participants, and then the impact it had on that participant. In the second study, which was carried out by Janice and Julieta, not Julieta, Julieta. So in that study, they focused on researcher agency in shaping the ways student participants relate to their experiences studying abroad, both in Germany and Argentina, and revealed the need for the researcher not to be erased from studies, but rather integrated as an active participant in the co-construction of study abroad students' practices and beliefs during the interviews. And then lastly, paper number 3, consider the research interview as a site where interculturality is co-constructed, right? So I hope I kind of, summarized accurately your study. So what I find is that I would say the central finding is that researchers' multiple identities and roles impact the co-construction of their interviewees' identities and study abroad discourses in a multiplicity of ways, right? So what I see the implications of their findings to be is that we need more, it underscores the need for researcher data and not only participant data. And actually, when I was reading, these studies, it made me think about some of the interviews that I conducted myself and the tendency as researchers to really only focus on the participants' participation, right? So it needs to be what the researcher is saying and doing during these interviews has to be incorporated. We need to pay greater attention to the different identities and roles performed during interviews and the contributions they make. So for example, when I received Victoria's paper, one thing that she did mention it today also in her presentation, is that initially, just like any researcher would do, she chose not to include her own contributions to the interaction she engaged in with our participants. But including them did reveal important elements that had been covered, overlooked in the process. So as I read my colleagues' papers, their findings and related implications, I could not help but think of some of the recent work of scholars like Fred Durbin, and some of you might have been at the last conference here, where he was the keynote speaker. And the focus of the conference was really taking stock of what had happened in the last 10 years in intercultural competence research and opening new ways of looking at it and what could be done about it. So I went back and looked a little bit at his work, and I found that he's actually been calling for adopting new research approaches in study abroad, approaches that are more reflective and allow researchers to examine the various layers of hidden discourses and provide greater details on identification and the co-constructive aspect of interaction. So I wanted to have this kind of a bridge between the last conference and what you actually did in this series of series of studies, right? So one thing that Durbin has noted is that analysis is often based on a simple review of what research participants say during data collection, whether we're doing with interviews or whether we're doing focus group interviews, which is an indication that their discourse is taken as face value. This is the truth. This is what's happening, right? And he has actually been hoping for a long time to see research that identifies and takes into account the various voices in discourses and suggests tools that would allow us to go deeper, to go below that surface that I think it was you mentioned in your presentation. And if we go back to G's notion of discourse, right? Discourse is always a subject's representation or perspective that is co-constructed, negotiated, and so on. So what Durbin has been asking, and other researchers, is that if we aim for a critical stance towards intercultural discourse, we should not be so much interested in what this participant is saying, but how this is actually happening. So when I look back at my colleagues' studies, I feel very much that they are individually, but also collectively responding in many ways, multiple ways, to Durbin's calls and others in the field. So for me, their research open up new lines of research, propose new approaches to collecting data, and most importantly, show how including data that has generally not been included, i.e. researcher data, ought to be included. So I would like next to point briefly some additional thoughts that I had, and I probably would have had more, but my goal when I went back and looked at the description of what my role as a discussant was mostly focusing on methodology and also theory or theoretical lenses. So when I think from a theoretical and analysis standpoint, and I heard that you're starting new research and so on, that might be something to think about. I'm thinking that sociocultural theory and sociocultural discourse analysis, which was promoted by Mercer, which is based on a sociocultural perspective on the nature and functions of language, thinking, and social interaction, might be actually an interesting lens. Because what I think the first thing that I did when I received your presentation was looking at the excerpts. And I think across presentation, across studies, across these excerpts, the teacher comes through all the time. So I think because this particular approach, right, has been largely used to analyze classroom discourse between teacher and students, so the basis of my proposition is that these interviews are actually, as you said, sites of co-constructed learning. So I think going back to some of the methodology or theoretical approaches to classroom discourse might also be something that could be potentially interesting, because you're teachers. I mean, you can see it through the data. You cannot avoid it. The as a way of getting students to say more, or repeating something, not to say I don't believe you, or you should think about this further, is happening too. So clearly that's you mentioned multiple identities, but I think this one is really coming through very strongly. There are others that are manifesting themselves, but I thought that this was really there. So, and language, within that particular lens, language is a tool for getting things done. So I think such an approach allows to relate the content, quality, and temporal nature of dialogue during interactions to the outcomes of what's happening. Next, I want to talk about methods and data collection. And methodologically speaking and thinking about data collection, I realized that in the kinds of studies you did and the approach you used, right, audio recordings are widely used and relatively easy to do. But I also think that important data is left uncaptured in the course of these interviews. For example, I am sure that gaze, gestures, posture can provide useful data on the negotiation of meaning and affect, which to me is relevant for your studies. I would have loved to see their faces, or they're sitting in cafes with you, or maybe in the school library, and I can imagine what some of your reaction to what they say might have caused them to push back, or wiggle on their chair, or gaze far away. And that would actually be yielding a lot of information. So I think, I think that video recording increases data density. And one other thing that I was wondering about is that whether you had played back your recordings to the participants to get them to recall and describe their thoughts, feelings, and reactions at different points in time during the given event, thus giving information about the unobservable. And maybe you as researchers, because you were making your data part of this, doing exactly the same thing in a more reflective way. So I agree video recording comes with its challenges because it's easy to actually put a tape recorder on the table and let it roll. When you're doing video recording, how do you go about doing this? Because you could hire a professional, but that professional is not necessarily in tune with what you're looking for. So it comes with a host of difficulties, but things that could be happening. And I think I don't know, Jamie, if these were photos or these were screenshots of the films that you took, but I also think that the visual is also very relevant. So anyway, I was just thinking that would add richness to the data. You mentioned the various identities that manifested itself when you were interviewing your participants. And I think, of course you can't do it here, but I'm just thinking about maybe going, and you're probably doing this, but maybe going beyond the label of researcher and teacher and co-national and all that. Because many of us here are co-nationals and it means something very different. Or even teacher. Teacher is one word, but it encompasses also. One thing that you also did not mention is that you're all mobile women. How is that mobility playing into your reaction to the data, right? Also the native view, right? This has been heavily discussed, so that might be something else that you would want to think about. And then lastly, and I think that mostly, did not so much come up with the first two papers, and I was thinking about the concept of interculturality and the choice of a particular model versus another might need to be explained. And maybe what are the issues coming with adopting maybe Byram's model versus another. So that was, so these were some of the thoughts, and as we move, that was the looking ahead. So it's thinking in terms of what other theoretical framework you could be considering, especially given that learner teaching or that teacher aspect of your study, thinking about data collection, and maybe data analysis through a different lens. Thank you. This is it.